Welcome to both of our online and our in-person attendees to this second day of our 15th annual Archaeology Weekend. I am enjoying the focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible this year. I very much enjoyed hearing an overview of the discovery of the scrolls and the various languages found written on the fragments from Dr. Tov. I loved hearing about Ms. Sabel al-Zabin, soon-to-be doctor, speaking of her father and his contributions to the archaeological projects we discuss here. When I taught history at Andrews many decades ago now, I went with Drs. LaBianca and Walker to the Hellespont in 2001, and I was helping to map out a small cave on that expedition. I'm not sure how much help I actually was, but it was an exciting adventure for me. As I was taking the requisite swim in the Dead Sea, I remember thinking about the Qumran caves and wondering if I could see them from where I was floating. I don't think I could, but I imagined that I could. I loved going on a tour yesterday of the Qumran sites with Dr. Magnus. I also enjoyed the discussion of possible mikveh or ritual bath sites. Some of my own study of rivers and indigenous histories, even in this part of the world, involved many rituals that it required total immersion into flowing rivers and bodies of water. It brings to mind the sometimes ignored cosmological crises that North American indigenous peoples experienced when they moved away from the flowing rivers in the American Southeast out to the arid regions in the West, and the transformation of culture, of ritual and customs to incorporate splashing or sprinkling of water instead of immersion and other adaptations like that. Who would have thought presentations on the Dead Sea Scrolls would be encouraging me to dig back into some of my own research on Cherokee and their interactions with the Tennessee River where I grew up, or even those on the Pacific Northwest who interacted with the Columbia River. While my dissertation research on U.S. Middle East relations looked at the Jordan River as a contested resource in the modern era, I often see in my mind's eye the long strands of connecting threads that 21st century people in the region hold in their hands that connect back through hundreds and thousands of years. Thank you, amazing scholars, for all the work that you do, the study you undertake, and the sharing of your work in this forum. And again, welcome to this second day of our Archaeology Weekend. Now I would like to turn the time over to the person who brought us all together, Dr. Clark.
Thank you, Provost Summit, for welcoming us. And I will add my welcome from the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology to you here and to our friends on Zoom and in live stream. And so I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Friedbert Ninow, who is the Dean of the Divinity School at La Sierra. Let the lectures begin.
Good afternoon. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Sidnie White Crawford. She is the Willa Cather Professor of Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism, emerita, it says here, but you look so young. Anyway, it is what it says here. At the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a visiting scholar, Department of Bible at Princeton Theological Seminary. She has worked extensively on the Dead Sea Scrolls and textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Her book, Scribes and Scrolls at Qumran, published by Eerdmans in 2019, was the winner of the Biblical Archaeology Society's Best Popular Book on Archaeology and the Frank Moore Cross Award from the American.
Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology for their warm hospitality over this weekend, and for all of you, both in person and virtually, for coming out for this series of talks. And for me, it's very nice to get to spend time with my colleagues in the field. So my topic today is, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls teach us about the Bible? The largest collection of scrolls was found in the 11 caves around the site of Khirbet Qumran in the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. And so you can see Qumran here. And so today I will be talking almost entirely about the Qumran scrolls. This is the first cave in which scrolls were discovered, Cave 1. And this is the great Isaiah scroll that came out of Cave 1, a complete manuscript of the book of Isaiah. And so when it was discovered and photographed, and the photographs were released in the 1940s, everyone was very excited because look at this beautiful scroll that's so clear and easy to read. Well, then they discovered Cave 4 in 1952, out of which about 10,000 fragments, or well, maybe a little less than that, came. And most of them looked like this. You can imagine that they were a little harder to read than the great Isaiah scroll. Here is another example. And this is the scrollery where they were first sorted. So after all the sorting, compiling, counting, and editing were completed, it turned out that about 25% of the manuscripts that were found in the Qumran caves were already known to us from the Jewish canon of Scripture. That is, they were biblical manuscripts. And probably all of you have heard that all the books found in the Jewish canon of Scripture, with the exception of the book of Esther, were found at Qumran in greater or lesser numbers. Now, as I say this, it's always important for us to recognize that we don't have the entire Qumran collection as it existed in antiquity. We know that some of the caves have collapsed. We know that some of them were plundered or pilfered in antiquity. And we really don't know how extensive the original collection of scrolls would have been. But we have the largest cache of Hebrew manuscripts that have ever been discovered, so we can't kind of complain about that. During the first decades of Qumran research, the fact that all the books except Esther of the Jewish canon of Scripture was found at Qumran was interpreted by scholars very simply. The Jews at Qumran had the same canon, the same Bible as Jews do today. And they also had other religious literature that they read and copied. But over the course of the 75 years since the scrolls have been discovered, and certainly in my scholarly lifetime, we have realized that that picture is not so simple. So this afternoon, I am going to attempt to guide you through the evidence of the manuscripts and to demonstrate that our previous picture of what the Bible is and how the canon of Scripture came to be has been both complicated and clarified by the Qumran scrolls. Then we will look at the actual text of those biblical scrolls to see how a Jewish community in the Second Temple period used the actual text of Scripture as a vehicle for interpretation, a very different procedure than what we think of as interpretation today. So first I'm going to start with some definitions. So we all think we know what a Bible is, right? There it is. But first of all, the word Bible, which implies to us one book, is really not very accurate, right? It comes from the Greek ta biblia, the books. And that immediately gives you a hint that really there are more than one book in this Bible. And the term Bible is an anachronism. It didn't exist in the last century BCE and the first century CE, the time of the existence of the Qumran settlement. And Jody said yesterday, settlement is a bad word, but I'm going to use it anyway. So a Bible really is a bound collection of individual books in the form of a codex. And a codex is a wonderful thing. It's probably one of the greatest inventions, I think. I'm a scholar. Heck, I love books. Of all time, because, you know, you can print pages on either side. It's all sewn together. You can carry it around in your hand. It's great. And people, it really helped to spread literacy very widely from the time of its invention in the 2nd century CE until today, when we're all going electronic. But prior to the invention of the codex, books existed as individual scrolls. That is, each book of the Bible was written on an individual separate scroll. And that meant that you didn't read them as one collection, you read them as separate books. And that really makes a difference on how you think about it. And in fact, we know that different religious communities have different canons of Scripture, although there is overlap among them. So I'll just take you briefly through them. So the first is actually the Samaritan community, which has its main location on Mount Gerizim in what today is the West Bank. And that the Samaritans are a community in the former northern territory of biblical Israel who claim descent from those northern Israelites, and they worship the God of Israel. During part of the Second Temple period, a very long part, they actually had a sanctuary on Mount Gerizim where they worshiped God according to their own traditions. And some of you may know that a Samaritan community still exists today and still carries out many of those worship traditions. So here you see the high priest of the Samaritans with a Samaritan Torah. And for their canon of Scripture, they only accept the 5 books of Moses or the Pentateuch. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They do not accept the other books of what we may think of as the Old Testament. The Jewish canon of Scripture is more extensive. It consists of the Torah, but then also the prophets, the first 4, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the historical books, or sometimes the former prophets, then the great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the book of the 12, which in antiquity was written on one scroll. And I don't know why Zechariah has nudged out there, but I wasn't meaning anything by that. All of those books appear at Qumran. The third category are the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Kohelet, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This time I had Esther a little off because it doesn't appear at Qumran, but all the others do. There's only one copy of Ezra Nehemiah found and one copy of Chronicles found. And the others only exist, except for Psalms, in smaller numbers. Then we turn to the Christian canon. First, the Protestant canon. In the Protestant canon, they have the Old Testament, which is equivalent to the Jewish canon of Scripture, with some of the books in a different order, and then they add the New Testament. Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Anglican churches have the same Old Testament as the Protestants, but then they add the books of the Deuterocanon, sometimes called the Apocrypha, and The book of Tobit was found at Qumran. The book of the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach was found at Qumran. The letter of Jeremiah was found at Qumran. The others were not. And then, if you belong to the Orthodox or the Slavonic churches, you add 1st Esdras, the Prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, and 3rd Maccabees, and Psalm 151 was found at Qumran. And then, if you belong to the Ethiopian or the Abyssinian Orthodox Church, you add the books of Jubilees and Enoch, and they were found at Qumran in large numbers, and it's clear that these books, even if they didn't make it into a canon of Scripture, were known by Jews and Christians during the Second Temple period. For example, you may not have realized this, but the book of Jude, the letter of Jude, that's one of those little small letters at the end of the New Testament. It quotes the book of Enoch. It says, "It was also about these that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, 'See, the Lord is coming with 10,000 of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict everyone of all the deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him.'" And that's a direct quote of 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. And the author of Jude is quoting this as prophecy. Very interesting. So what I want you to take away from this is that different people mean different things when they say the word Bible. And so we can't always assume that we are all saying the same thing. And so we should be very careful to use the word Bible when it comes to the Qumran scrolls. So how did these collections of literature become sacred scripture in different communities of faith? When did they become the Bible? And who decided, right? And that's the question of canon. And the Qumran scrolls actually do shed light on this question of canon. A canon is made up of sacred authoritative texts, and this is a kind of working definition of that: an individual work that a religious community acknowledges as having authority over the faith and practice of its members. And I want to emphasize here that phrase religious community, right? It's kind of a two-way street, right? You have a text that wants to be authoritative, but if you don't have a community that accepts it as such, it doesn't matter, right? A canon, then, is a collection of individual sacred compositions that become authoritative and standard for defining religious belief and practice. And so it's the community of believers that accepts a book as canonical. And, you know, you might think, oh yeah, I guess that's right. But we really don't think about that in practice very often, right? But we need to think about it when we think about the Qumran scrolls. So it used to be thought that the Jewish community, led by the rabbis, finalized their canon of scripture by the end of the 1st century CE, after the fall of the Second Temple in 70. At a place called Yavna or Jamnia. Our new knowledge calls that old consensus into question. Instead, the growth of the canon and how religious texts became sacred scripture, and eventually the Bible, is better described as a process in which eventually, over a period of centuries, consensus was reached. And in fact, Esther, which remember was missing from Qumran, it was one of the last books of the Jewish canon of scripture to be accepted as sacred and authoritative. But early in that process, say the 2nd the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, the time of the Qumran scrolls, different communities within the same religious community, in this case Judaism, might disagree on whether or not a specific individual book was sacred scripture, just as today different Christian denominations have slightly different canons of scripture. So now we're going to talk about what there was before the canon. So how are books accepted? How do they become authoritative? Is there evidence for a canon, or at least a list of a group of authoritative texts in the Qumran collection of scrolls? Well, they didn't leave us a list, which is unfortunate. So we have to rely on clues left by the communities who read and copied the books. And there are 3 major clues. The first is a work identified by being quoted as authoritative? Remember when I showed you the slide of Jude, it said that Enoch prophesied, right? That's giving that text authority, okay? So here we have a quotation from one of the sectarian texts, the Damascus document, and it says, "A man shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife while the first is alive. Whereas the principle of creation is male and female created he them, and those who went into the ark 2 by 2. So here's the Damascus document quoting Genesis 1:27, right, from the creation story found there, and chapter 7, verse 9 from the story of Noah, to support their understanding of how marriage should work. And actually, people argue about this. Does it mean that this community did not countenance divorce at all or not? So, but I won't get into that. But what I want you to see is here it is quoting Genesis. So obviously, for the community that produced the Damascus document, Genesis must have been an authoritative text. Sometimes they will comment on an entire book. So, for example, the books known as the Pesharim, which have the phrase in them, its interpretation is Pishro, comments on entire books. So obviously, if they're commenting on a text, if they're interpreting it, they believe that that text is authoritative for their community. So we have commentaries, or Pesharim, found at Qumran on the books of Genesis, Habakkuk, Nahum, Psalms, Isaiah, Hosea, Micah, Zephaniah, and Malachi. Examples from the Torah, examples from the prophets, and one example from the writings, the book of Psalms. And here's an example from Pesher Habakkuk. So first it quotes Habakkuk 1:6a, "For now I am about to raise up the Chaldeans, that brutal and reckless people." Then there's that phrase, its interpretation is, Pishro, "The Kittim, who are swift and mighty in war, annihilating many. The land shall be under the rule of the Kittim. They shall inherit many lands and have no faith in the laws of God." So this community is taking the book of Habakkuk, the older book, and interpreting it. And I think Professor Jason is going to talk a lot more about that coming up. But what I want you to see is clearly they thought it had authority to be interpreted. Right? Okay, another clue to authoritative status is, were there multiple copies of a book? Now, this is a little slippy because, as I said, we don't have the complete collection of scrolls. And, we don't know exactly the reasons why some books seem to be more popular than others. But with those caveats, multiple copies indicate that they thought the book was important. So at Qumran, we have many books found in multiple copies: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So all the books of the Torah. Multiple copies of Psalms, multiple copies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and other prophets, but then also multiple copies of Enoch and Jubilees. That's an interesting fact to look at. We have very few copies of these books. Is that indicative of anything? Maybe, maybe not. Although it indicates that clearly they were reading those books less than the other ones, right? They were not central to their thinking. Then the last clue is authoritative presentation. And what I mean by that is, does the book present itself as coming from a divinely inspired figure in the past, Moses, right? Is it written in the name of Moses or some other ancient figure, such as Enoch, right? We have texts at Qumran written in the name of Levi, for example. We have the Temple Scroll. The Temple Scroll is written in the first-person voice of God. That's a pretty authoritative claim, right? But did they accept it as such, right? This is where you get to the community of believers. Do they accept the book as having the authority that it's claiming? So we can say clearly for the Torah or Pentateuch, yes. For the books of Enoch, we think so. For the Temple Scroll, we don't really have any particular evidence for that. And for Jubilees, yes, we have it quoted in the Damascus document referred to by name. So, was the Temple Scroll authoritative? In some books you'll find, they'll give the list and they'll say yes, and other books will say no, and that's because we're not sure. So we don't, some things we can't answer definitively. Now, how did we get to the 1st century BCE and these books that are now in written form and are accepted as authoritative by the community of Jews? Well, it's likely that the process began early in the Second Temple period, in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. So, for example, in the book of Nehemiah, there's a narrative that says, "They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Accordingly, the priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly." Now, the story says that Ezra came from Babylon to Judea and had a book of the law of Moses. We don't really know. First of all, we can't tell exactly what happened, and we don't really know what is meant by this Torah Sefer Moshe. Was it our Pentateuch? Maybe. Was it some earlier form? Maybe. We don't really know. But we do know that by the 3rd century BCE, the books of the Pentateuch, in pretty much the form we have them, were available in the Jewish community and had been translated into Greek. So most scholars think that all 5 books of the Pentateuch, by pretty much the mid-3rd into the early 2nd century, are accepted as authoritative. And all 5 books of the Pentateuch exist at Qumran in multiple copies. They're quoted extensively and are referred to as authoritative. Now, what about the prophets and the writings? Well, in the late 2nd century BCE, in the prologue of the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sira, or you may know the book by its Latin title, Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sira says, "Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books. Okay, well, that could sound like the law, the prophets, and the writings, but again, do we really know that when he says the prophets, that he means what we mean, and what precisely he means by the others or the rest of the books? So again, there seems to be here in the late 2nd century BCE a move toward canon, but we're probably not there yet. There's a composition found at Qumran, a sectarian composition called 4QMMT that probably comes from the late 2nd century BCE. And it says, and furthermore, we have written to you that you should understand the book of Moses, now that's filled in by the editors, and the books of the prophets and David. Now, books of the prophets and David are clear. So, books of the prophets, are they the same as our books of the prophets? Well, we don't know that for sure, but there clearly are prophets. And then David, what does that mean? Right? Does it mean the book of Psalms as we have it? Well, we don't know. So let's look at the Qumran evidence. Oh, let's look at this first. In the manuscript 11Q Psalms A, column 27, it says the following. Now David, the son of Jesse, was wise and shone like the light of the sun, a scribe and a man of discernment, blameless in all his ways before God and men. The Lord gave him a brilliant and discerning spirit, so that he wrote 3,600 psalms, not 150, right? The sum total of everything, psalms and songs, was 4,050. All these he composed through prophecy given him by the Most High. So here the psalms are associated with prophecy, which is very interesting. Another little hint about what they saw as authoritative. So, what do we find at Qumran? Well, we have the books of the Torah, we have the books of the prophets, and then we do have the books of the writings with the exception of Ezra, so that we can say that all of those books which came from the classical literature of ancient Israel, were considered important enough at Qumran to exist in at least one copy. We also have Enoch in 11 copies and Jubilees in either 14 or 15 copies, which are quoted or alluded to extensively. And it's very clear that the community of Qumran, however we define that, right, thought that Enoch and Jubilees were authoritative books. And especially important to them were the books of the Torah. They had Deuteronomy in 36 copies, the book of Psalms, and the book of Isaiah. Now, it's really interesting that those are the books that are quoted most extensively in the New Testament as well. We don't have anywhere, they also quote as authoritative Joshua, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets, but they never quote Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings. So they're there, but what kind of status they had, we can't be sure of. So the other books, or the rest of the books, which we think have something to do with the writings, certainly the Psalms they considered authoritative, right? They were writing Pesher interpretations on the Psalms. The other ones, Proverbs, Daniel, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth, and Lamentations. They don't quote them, they copy them, but we can't be sure, again, about their status. So, with the snapshot that the Qumran library gives us, we have, it is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of a process that's underway in this period, but is not finished or absolutely determined yet, and there are going to be changes within Judaism after this. So now I'm going to move to textual questions. The text of the Hebrew Bible and textual witnesses at Qumran. So here I'm going to be talking about the actual words of the authoritative texts. Professor Tove talked a little bit about this yesterday. Prior to the discoveries at Qumran, we really had three major witnesses to the text of the Hebrew Bible. The Masoretic text, which is the Jewish canonical text. It's a medieval text, but it's based on older texts. And the oldest copies we had were the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, which are early medieval copies. Then we had the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of a Hebrew text. And there are Greek papyri very early from the 2nd century, and then we have complete codices from the 4th century. And then for just the Torah, we had the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is also a medieval text, but is the canonical text of the Samaritans. Now, the discoveries at Qumran take us back 1,000 years from those Hebrew witnesses, because the oldest manuscripts of authoritative books or scriptural texts at Qumran go back as early as the 3rd century BC, and at Qumran move forward to the 1st century CE. So prior to Qumran, we already knew that different textual forms of the same book existed. But when we began to look at the Qumran biblical manuscripts, we found all sorts of evidence for variation. And you always have to remember the pictures I showed you, these are all hand-copied manuscripts. So a certain amount of variation is to be expected when you're hand copying, right? This is not a printing press. A textual variant is a difference between two or more textual witnesses. And some of them are interesting but not important for the history of the text. So a word may be spelled differently. You know, we're very familiar with that from, say, Shakespeare, where words are spelled differently all over the place, right? So differences in spelling or grammatical forms, that's all very interesting for grammarians, but it really doesn't tell us anything about the actual words of the text. But the important variants are differences in words, whether they are large phrases or more than that, or small, a single word. So you can have simple error, mistakes that creep in inadvertently and then continue to be copied, right? Because scribes did make mistakes, and then the next scribe copied the mistake, and it just got handed down. But the variants are what we call deliberative or diagnostic. That is, a scribe at some point made a change deliberately in the text. And sometimes we can sort of trace the history of that change, and other times we're not so sure. Sometimes there is what we call a contemporizing variant that is trying to bring the text up to date for its reading audience. So this is a kind of a funny one, okay? This is from 1 Samuel 17:4. It's about Goliath. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. That's what the Masoretic text has, and so in most of your English translations, that's what you have. And a cubit is the length of measure here for a man, and a span is the span of a hand. Well, the manuscript 4Q Samuel A and the Septuagint have 4 cubits. Some Greek manuscripts have 5 cubits. We have a Latin manuscript that has 16 cubits. So how tall was Goliath? Well, it's kind of obvious that as people got taller, right, the scribes kind of updated things to make Goliath taller because he's got to be a giant. So we can kind of tell what happened there, and we can say, well, we can't really tell how tall Goliath was, but he was really tall. It's probable that the earliest reading was 4, the smallest, and then it went forward. But others really do make a difference in interpretation. And so this is an example from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. Professor Tove actually showed you one of the manuscripts of this yesterday. In the Masoretic text, the verse reads, "He established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel, Bnei Yisrael." But in the Septuagint, it said, "He established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, the Huion The'u." Until the discovery of the scrolls, if you read a text critical commentary, you would see different understandings of what had gone on, and maybe a thinking that the Septuagint was being interpretative or something. But then, after Qumran, there was discovered a Hebrew manuscript, 4Q Deuteronomy J, that says, "He established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim." So the Greek was a direct translation of that Hebrew phrase. So then the question is, which is earlier? Can we tell? Well, the translators responsible for the New Revised Standard Version thought that the Septuagint and the Qumran manuscript are earlier because they say the number of the gods. But if you read other translations, you might get B'nai Yisrael. For example, in the New Jewish Publication Society translation, which translates the MT, you will get sons of Israel. So how do you determine which is earlier? Well, in this case, I think that the Hebrew reading found in the Masoretic text is later. It is a change made by a scribe for theological reasons who was uncomfortable with this idea that there were other gods besides the God of Israel, and, that's how many peoples there are. Now, that was a pretty common idea in earlier times, but, maybe it wasn't so palatable later. So that's an example of a real diagnostic variant that we find in the scrolls. So, what do we find at Qumran? Well, we find that some books were very stable. For example, Leviticus has very few significant variants. Some manuscripts looked exactly like their Masoretic text version that came down to us, right? For example, 4Q Deuteronomy G doesn't differ from the Masoretic text at all. But other texts don't look like the Masoretic text at all. Some look like the Samaritan Pentateuch, and in fact, we now think that before the Samaritans took the Pentateuch as their canonical text, there was a text that was sort of a pre-Samaritan text, which is characterized by harmonization and content editing, making sure that the different parts of the Pentateuch are in agreement. And you find this phenomenon chiefly in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy 1-3. And here's an example of that. This is the pre-Samaritan text of Exodus 20:21, and the plus is for the insertion. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the sound of the words of this people. So you see that Deuteronomy 5 and 18, verses from there, are inserted before MT Exodus 20:21. So we have pre-Samaritan scrolls at Qumran, and then we also have scrolls at Qumran whose forlaga, who seem to resemble the forlaga, the Hebrew parent text of the Septuagint. So 4Q Deuteronomy Q, 4Q Deuteronomy J, and 4Q Samuel A are the most obvious examples of that. The book of Jeremiah existed in a short form that looked like the Septuagint, and also in a long form that resembled the Masoretic text. The book of Psalms, the first 3 books from 1 to 89 seem to have been very stable in this period, but the last 2 books, they hadn't made up their minds yet. They were very fluid. And now I'm gonna stop there because I'm running out of time. So what point do I want to make? The point is that we learned that the text of the Bible, which we tend to think is fixed, you can't change it, right? It's the Bible. That is not how they thought about it. They thought of it as sacred scripture for the most part, probably not Esther Chronicles, but they thought of it as sacred scripture. But they also thought they believed that their duty as scribes, as people passing on the text, was to make it understandable for the people who would be reading it. And so they could introduce changes into that text, and that was part of their job as scribes. So the role of the scribe was not as a simple copyist. And that's a very different attitude than our contemporary attitude. And it really turned our thinking about the history of the biblical text upside down, right? It didn't come like this with sort of one parent, an Ur text, and then went like this, right? Rather, there seems to have been much more variation with maybe, parents up here, and then the stream contracts and we get the MT, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. So this is what the Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us about the history of the Bible, and thank you very much.